Segment 5A, Introduction. In this lecture, we examine the United States' political and social life in the years leading up to the American Civil War of 1861 to 1865. Seen from the outside, America was not just growing in size and population. It was managing its growth responsibly. On the other hand, there were cracks in the American political system and social fabric which nearly tore the nation apart. In Segment 5B, Our Manifest Destiny, the American nation's success leads its people to a growing sense of mission. North America was meant to be civilized from sea to shining sea, and the United States was the country to do it. As Americans saw it, this civilizing mission extended not just westward, but southward into Mexico and northward into the so-called Oregon country. President James K. Polk, Napoleon of the Stump, first got the economy going by adjusting the nation's tariffs and by bringing about an independent treasury. In foreign policy, Polk resolved the Oregon question by negotiating with Great Britain. On the other hand, he addressed relations with Mexico by starting a war. Among other critics of Polk's war, the young Illinois Congressman Abraham Lincoln had harsh words for the president's actions. Yet nobody can deny that the Mexican War, whatever its true causes, was the key to America's westward development. Segment 5C, Life in the Good Old Days, examines American life on the eve of the Civil War, in the North, in the South, and in the rapidly growing Midwest. By roughly 1850, the industrialized North and agricultural South were on two different economic paths. The North's factories made the northern upper class wealthy, and the workers sometimes shared in the prosperity too. The North also managed to build close ties physically and financially with the rural economy of the fast-growing Midwest. Meanwhile, the worldwide demand for Southern cotton grew, making Southern planters wealthy. But King Cotton, as the industry was called, was also severely limited. King Cotton depended on plentiful slave labor, and its tendency to wear out the soil meant it always required more new farmland. The stage was thus set for free soilers and slave owners to fight over Western territory. Socially, the American people were becoming more advanced, with more care paid to poorer people and to public services. But not, unfortunately, so advanced that slavery was abolished, or that women were given a right to choose their own paths in life, or even allowed to vote. In Segment 5D, of Human Bondage, the United States at last confronts the evil which nearly defeated it, human slavery. Half-hearted attempts were made to postpone this impending catastrophe. The Compromise of 1850 and the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1853. But the slave state supporters fought violently for what they saw as economic and social survival. Meanwhile, the abolitionists, who were, in fact, on the side of justice, alienated even Northerners with their self-righteous zeal and their equal taste for violence. At one point, the Kansas Territory, also known as Bloody Kansas, had two separate capitals, one slave and one free soil, each with its own legislature and its own government. The election of self-avowed Unionist Abraham Lincoln to the presidency in 1860 prompted 11 Southern states to secede from the Union. These Southern states later formed the Confederate States of America. President Lincoln considered these secessions a mere rebellion, and he moved to preserve the Union by force. On April 12, 1861, Confederate troops fired upon Fort Sumter off of Charleston, South Carolina, and the American Civil War was on. the nation, the great experiment, nearly failed. Segment 5B, Our Manifest Destiny. Expansionism and Manifest Destiny. The American population was booming. The Louisiana Territory was beginning to fill up. As a result of victory in the War of 1812 and the success of the Monroe Doctrine, America enjoyed international prestige. Americans naturally attributed their nation's rise to their freedoms, their ideals, and their relation with Providence, as illustrated on the Great Seal. Annuit coeptes, baby. Americans began to think the United States was literally destined to rule America from east to west, or from sea to shining sea. The Jacksonian Democrats, so called after Old Hickory, Andrew Jackson, the Indian fighter, urged expansionism. Expansionism involved the addition of the most possible territory to the United States. Even if Canada was off limits for good, and even though it seemed that the British would fight for the Oregon Territory, there was always Mexico. In 1844, New York journalist John O'Sullivan coined the term manifest destiny in an essay arguing for the annexation of the Republic of Texas. In a more influential 1845 essay supporting annexation of the Oregon Territory, O'Sullivan explained, quote, "And that claim is by the right of our manifest destiny, to overspread and to possess the whole of the continent, which Providence has given us for the development, the great experiment of liberty, and federated self-government entrusted to us." End quote. Those who supported American expansion were slow to seize on this term. At first, manifest destiny was used as a curse word, a derogatory term, by the dying political party known as the Whigs, which feared that expansion would somehow dilute America's stable government. But Jacksonian Democrats, such as Tennessee's James K. Polk, quickly recognized this term's appeal. Manifest destiny implied that the Americans were a uniquely superior people, specifically ordained by God to spread civilization throughout North America. This idea was nothing new. Many other great powers had already experienced it. But it was new to the United States. Northerners saw a manifest destiny as a wonderful opportunity for the nation's economy in general, and for the North in particular. Southerners saw manifest destiny as a wonderful opportunity to ensure the continued growth of their cotton economy, otherwise known as King Cotton. In short, manifest destiny seemed to have something to offer for every American. Napoleon of the Stump. In 1844, James K. Polk became America's youngest president yet, at age 49. Polk campaigned for the presidency on a four-point platform: annex the Oregon Territory, annex Mexico's North American territory, establish an independent treasury, and reduce crippling tariffs. Polk believed that lower tariffs, that is to say a tax set on foreign goods, would benefit everybody by stimulating the economy. If foreign trade picked up, tax revenues would jump, and so would the American public's buying power. Polk's instrument was the Walker Tariff, which was based not on an imported product's value, but rather equally put on all goods. Even the Northerners, who liked the previous tariff system, which put exorbitant amounts of added money on these things, had to acknowledge that the Walker Tariff actually worked as Polk had intended. In fact, the Walker Tariff also gave the U.S. Treasury more than enough money to pursue Polk's expansionist foreign policy. President Polk's first policy goal was to obtain a settlement of the Oregon Territory. Despite Lewis and Clark's efforts, the territory was still underexplored. Land-hungry American squatters were moving north of the 49th parallel, which had for a long time been the working boundary. This prompted the expansionist war cry 54-40 or fight. But neither the United States nor Britain was interested in fighting over Oregon, when they got on so well in all other respects. The 1846 Oregon Treaty established the 49th parallel as a permanent boundary between the United States and what is now Canada. With the nation's northern boundary stabilized for good, Polk was free to look south. Even though the Mexican Republic had openly emulated and idolized the United States since it started, U.S.-Mexican relations had been strained for a decade by the time Polk came to office. Hungry as ever for new lands, American settlers had started moving into the northeast Mexican states of Coahuila and Tejas. Welcomed at first, the settlers soon wore out their welcome by openly calling for union with the United States. In 1836, settlers seceded from Mexico and declared what they called the Republic of Texas. The Texans were defeated at the Alamo, but their later victory at San Jacinto established a nation, Texas, which still openly wanted to rejoin the United States. In 1845, President Polk quite happily saw to it that the Republic of Texas became an American state. The Mexicans, who were naturally unhappy, protested angrily. Intent on grabbing even more Mexican land, Polk staged a supposed Mexican attack, which goaded Congress into declaring war on Mexico. Yet not everyone was fooled by Polk's tactics. As a young Whig congressman from Illinois pointed out, both on the House floor and in the following letter to a friend, Polk was pretty transparent. The provision of the Constitution giving the war-making power to Congress was dictated, as I understand it, by the following reasons. Kings had always been involving and impoverishing their people in wars, pretending generally, if not always, that the good of the people was the object. This our convention understood to be the most oppressive of all kingly oppressions, and they resolved to so frame the Constitution that no one man should hold the power of bringing this oppression upon us. But your view destroys the whole matter and places our president where kings have always stood, end quote. Representative Abraham Lincoln's bold stand almost cost him his political career. He lost his congressional seat when his party refused to endorse him again in 1849. 12 years later, President Lincoln would be declaring effective war upon the Confederacy. Yet the Mexican War, began in 1846, was wildly successful in defeating the Mexicans. Up to a point, it was highly popular. Thanks to Polk's economic reforms, the U.S. could pay upfront for 60% of the war's costs. After Mexico City fell in 1848, the war was ended by the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. Thanks to this treaty, America gained Texas, California, and the major parts of Arizona and New Mexico. Nearly 1.2 million square miles of new land. Regardless of how one feels about the means Polk used to start it, the Mexican War brought great benefit to the United States. The importance of the former Mexican territory to our nation's development cannot be understated. For instance, the California Gold Rush of 1848 drew American people west and poured millions of dollars into the young nation's economy, as did the new state of Texas. Because California became so heavily settled, the United States would simultaneously expand westward from the Mississippi River Valley and eastward from California. When the United States wanted to buy more Mexican land to straighten the borders out some, the Gadsden Purchase of 1853, the Mexicans wisely kept quiet and sold it. The Mexicans were the first to learn not to get in between the United States and its manifest destiny. Segment 5C, Life in the Good Old Days. For decades, the United States had performed a balancing act between the industrialized, free soil North and the agricultural, slave-owning South. When the nation was established, it looked as if slavery would wither away in the United States. This hope was shared by Northerners and Southerners alike. But with the invention of the cotton gin and technological advances such as spinning machinery and the steamboat, cotton became king in the South. King cotton required slave labor, and plenty of it. Even though Southerners such as Washington, Jefferson, and Madison were slave owners, they had hoped the institution would die. They were replaced, though, by leaders like John C. Calhoun, who resigned from the vice presidency in 1832 because he could do the South more good as senator from North Carolina. Southern leaders fought hard for what they saw as the Southern lifestyle. States had to be added in pairs, one free state with one slave state. Indiana, 1816, entered the Union with Mississippi, 1817. Illinois, 1818, entered with Alabama, 1819. This arrangement became law with the Missouri Compromise of 1820. Maine entered in 1820 as a free state, accompanied in 1821 by Missouri as a slave state. In the final three pairs, the slave state preceded the free state. Arkansas in 1836 and Michigan in 1837, Florida and Texas in 1845, followed by Iowa in 1846 and Wisconsin in 1848. North and South. By 1850, prosperity abounded in New England and the Middle Atlantic, where manufacturing, trade, and banking drove the economy. Thanks to the Industrial Revolution, factories produced far more for their owners, even if the workers who did the producing may or may not have benefited much from it. Thanks to America's world power status and friendship with Britain, American ships traded all around the world, serving not only American markets, although these were certainly important, but the international market too. Yet, the more industry thrived, the more class differences grew. Individual craftsmen found it harder and harder to compete with the factories, and were not happy with the waves of immigrants willing to do menial factory work. The industrialists, for their part, believed, not without reason, that they were the ones risking their capital and they were personally entitled to all the benefits they could extract from their factories. To the south, agriculture drove the economy. Tobacco, rice, sugar, and especially, again, cotton. Thanks to the Industrial Revolution, the world had acquired an enormous appetite for cotton, and the United States produced more than 80% of the world's cotton supply. Yet cotton was a very labor-intensive crop, which meant that human slavery remained crucial to the Southern economy. Individual small farmers could still survive if they worked very hard, but most moved west in search of better farmland. Moreover, cotton was very hard on the soil, and the planters knew that if the Southern economy was to survive, or much less expand, slavery would have to expand into the Western territories. The admission of Texas into the United States was a major boost to slaveholding interests, but Texas was more suited to cattle ranching than cotton production. Texas itself would not be enough to help the South match the economic progress of the rapidly growing North. Sadly, the founders had either failed or refused to consider the possibility of North-South division. This caused a tremendous sectional struggle, which ended in civil war. The new frontier. The Midwest was growing by leaps and bounds too. It was being settled not just by immigrants, but by restless Northerners and Southerners. The Louisiana Purchase, except for Missouri, began really filling up after 1840. Not only farmers moved west, Thomas Lincoln, father of Abraham, was one example, moving from Kentucky to Indiana to Illinois, but merchants and skilled craftsmen too. Whatever Midwesterners grew or produced and could not eat or use themselves, the Northeast was happy to purchase. What the Northwest could not consume, it exported. By the start of the Civil War, the Midwest was producing more than 170 million bushels of grain per year, much of which went to the Northeast by boat or by one of the railway lines which began to spring up all over the United States. The South experienced the railroad boom too, but the strong railroad links between North and Midwest helped keep the Midwest in the Union during the Civil War. It would be hard to blame the Southerners for getting the feeling that they were being surrounded. Progress and regress. Americans were divided in other ways. The wave of Irish and German Catholic immigrants arriving in the first half of the century caused a backlash among native-born Protestant Americans. Aside from their unusual customs and religious practices, Catholic immigrants competed with native-born Protestants for jobs. Because of their number and the ease of acquiring citizenship, the new immigrants gained considerable political clout at the expense of the previously Protestant establishment. This would cause internal tensions. Citizens also strove for greater rights and opportunities. By 1860, thanks to organized labor, the 10-hour workday was a generally accepted standard around the nation. The need for a literate, educated citizen body caused the establishment of free tax-supported schools across the North and in some parts of the South. Prisons, social welfare, and even the prohibition of alcohol became public issues as Americans worked to ensure life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness for just about everyone. The position of women in society remained completely unequal. Although there was some tradition of some young women being allowed to pursue their choice of career, this was generally true for a number of careers only, and only until marriage. Then, as always, individual women found ways to rise above society's arbitrary obstacles. By the 1840s, a women's rights movement emerged under the leadership of Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott. Cady Stanton recognized that for all of women's pressing concerns, equality before the law, equal access to education, equal right to take part in public life, the right to vote had to come first, which it finally did in 1920. I can't guarantee that the American Civil War would not have happened if women had been allowed to vote and hold political office. On the other hand, if women voters and female elected officials couldn't possibly have messed things up any worse than the men wound up doing. Segment 5D of Human Bondage. Dancing around the problem. From the very beginning of America's history, the founders despaired of reconciling the slave and free states. Various half measures were taken. The rule that a slave counted for 3/5 of a free person for tax and election purposes. Letting the international slave trade continue until 1808, and the banning of slavery in the Northwest Territory. Northerners and Southerners alike hoped that slavery would just die out. But the rise of King Cotton and its domination of the Southern economy just made slavery stronger. Thanks to the Missouri Compromise of 1820, adding slave and free states to the Union on a one-for-one basis was the law of the land. Meanwhile, around the world, slavery was being phased out. The United States was being criticized for not joining this important trend. Even Russia was on the verge of freeing its serfs. Try as it might to solve the problem, America was merely holding off the inevitable. The ultimate solution to the slavery crisis nearly destroyed us. As early as 1830, groups of middle-class Northerners began demanding what they called abolition, freedom, and full civil rights for enslaved blacks. Yet half measures like the Missouri Compromise held the Union largely intact until the Mexican War added massive new territories to the U.S. Because territorial questions were handled by Congress, the extension of slavery became the hot-button political issue. Southerners suspected a Northern plot against the Southern economy. Northerners were suspicious of President James K. Polk. Polk wouldn't fight Great Britain for Oregon, a free territory, but he started a war with Mexico over Texas, which was slated to become a slave territory. Northerners supported the Wilmot Proviso, which would have kept slavery out of all former Mexican territory. Polk, the Southerner, wanted to extend the Missouri Compromise line all the way from Missouri to Southern California. On top of that came the 1848 California Gold Rush, which drew in tens of thousands of settlers and made California's statehood an issue far earlier than expected. There was no slave state ready to be added to the Union along with California. And this led to all sorts of strange proposals we don't have time for here. More half measures. The Compromise of 1850 was a doomed attempt to fix the situation. Under this agreement, Texas was designated a slave state, but California could enter as a free state. The Utah and New Mexico territories would make their own decisions about slavery under something called popular sovereignty. That is, they would vote up or down whether they would have slavery in their own territories. The slave trade, but not slavery, was banned in the District of Columbia, and a strong fugitive slave law went into effect. Typically, this solution solved next to nothing. The Southerners wanted strict enforcement of the fugitive slave law, but Northerners basically ignored it. Some Northern states even declared the fugitive slave law to be illegal. Harriet Beecher Stowe's 1852 bestseller, Uncle Tom's Cabin, aided the abolitionist cause immensely. Even though its African-American characters were grossly stereotypical by modern standards, Uncle Tom's Cabin also brought home, or brought north, an accurate picture of how human slavery deprived the blacks of human dignity. Meanwhile, settlers were moving past Missouri into Kansas, raising once more the question whether Kansas would be free or slave. The 1853 Kansas-Nebraska Act provided once more for popular sovereignty, this time in Kansas and Nebraska. Nebraska, which held little attraction for cotton planters, was no problem. But popular sovereignty, Kansas style, meant two competing state governments, one free soil, one pro-slave, and a bitter fight over which of the two constitutions would be accepted when Kansas was admitted to the Union. Both Northern abolitionists and Southern slavery supporters financed settlements in Kansas, hoping to get a majority. Slave-holding Missourians came over the state border to help support the pro-slavery Kansans. Free soil Kansans returned the favors with jayhawking expeditions into slave-holding areas of Missouri. Meanwhile, both Northern abolitionists and Southern slaveholders raised money to equip more and more well-armed parties of quote-unquote settlers to help their respective causes. This battleground of popular sovereignty became known as Bleeding Kansas. The elections of 1860. In the roll-up to the elections of 1860, Southerners and Northerners alike had plenty to be mad about. The 1856 beating of Massachusetts Senator Charles Sumner by South Carolina Congressman Preston Brooks over a slavery-resulted insult scandalized the North and thrilled the South. That same year, pro-slavery Kansans attacked and burned the free soil city of Lawrence. In return, an anti-slavery fanatic named John Brown killed 5 pro-slavery settlers at Pottawatomie Creek. Meanwhile, the Supreme Court ruled in the case of Dred Scott that no black could be a citizen of the United States, and that it was moreover unconstitutional to ban slaveholding anywhere in the Union. This decision spurred the abolitionists to new heights of outrage. President James Buchanan, a Pennsylvanian but a strong Southern sympathizer, recommended that Congress accept Kansas into the Union with a slave-holding constitution. This was too much for the Northern Democrats to bear, and they joined with the Republicans to defeat this measure in Congress. With the Democratic Party split into Northern and Southern wings over the Kansas question, the way looked open for an anti-slavery Republican candidate to win the presidency in 1860. When Republican Abraham Lincoln did just that, the Southern states quickly declared that they were through with the United States. By spring 1861, 11 Southern states had seceded from the Union and formed the Confederate States of America. denying that these 11 states had the right to secede. Missouri and Kentucky would try later, but failed to secede. President Lincoln declared that they were merely in rebellion. Lincoln then called for troops to help keep the so-called rebellious states in the Union. On April 12, 1861, Confederate troops fired on the Union garrison at Fort Sumter, near Charleston, South Carolina. The American Civil War was officially on. By the time the war ended in 1865, more than 1 million Americans, counting both sides, had been killed or wounded. Entire sections of the country were devastated. The tragedy of this whole thing is underscored by the fact that Tsar Alexander II, autocratic ruler by grace of God of Russia, was able to free Russia's serfs with the flick of his pen. What Great Britain couldn't accomplish in 1776 or in 1812, the United States nearly accomplished all by itself. Segment 5E, Conclusions. In 1844, the Democrats were split. 3 nominees for the presidential candidate were Martin Van Buren, a former president and an abolitionist; James Buchanan, a moderate; Lewis Cass, a general and expansionist. From Nashville came a dark horse riding up, Mr. James K. Polk, Napoleon of the Stump. Austere, severe, he held few people dear. His oratory filled his foes with fear. The faction soon agreed he's just the man we need to bring about victory, fulfill our manifest destiny, and annex the land the Mexicans command. And when the vote was cast, the winner was Mr. James K. Polk, Napoleon of the Stump. In 4 short years, he met his every goal. He seized the whole Southwest from Mexico, made sure the tariffs fell, and made the British sell the Oregon Territory. He built an independent treasury. For all of this, he sought no second term. But precious few have mourned the passing of Mr. James K. Polk, our 11th president, young Hickory, Napoleon of the Stump. 2. North versus South. The Civil War was mostly brought on by a failure to address the issue of slavery. But to be fair, the people of the time would likely mention other concerns. The average Confederate soldier was not likely to be a slave owner, didn't have the money. He would also be likely to say he was fighting not for slavery, but for his state's right to make its own state laws. A Northern soldier would likely say he was fighting for the Union, and unless he was an abolitionist, didn't likely care about slaves one way or another. The Confederate Army had no monopoly on prejudice against blacks. The Copperheads, who wished to make peace with the Confederacy and let it go its own way, were supported even by some Union generals. By 1863, once the rush to enlist was over, many Northerners flat out refused to fight in a war that was thought to be going on to free black slaves. Meanwhile, black ex-slaves who wanted to fight in the United States Army were driven away until some sort of sanity prevailed. Even when blacks were allowed to wear uniforms and take a bullet for the Union cause, they did so commanded by white officers. 3. Some are more equal than others. The Civil War almost tore the country apart. But in this case, it wasn't the bullet that nearly killed America, it was the whole. The founders' unwillingness to tackle the slave issue left a gaping wound on our nation, which even the 13th Amendment of 1865 could not heal. Slavery was abolished, but still segregation ruled. Women gained the right to vote only in 1920. Blacks and women were not the only ones experiencing discrimination. As mentioned earlier, Mormons were hassled, driven out of the Midwest for their beliefs, but at least they were considered human, as opposed to the Chinese and other Orientals who were brought in by the boatload to work at labor-intensive tasks and virtually treated like slaves. Europeans were not exempt either. The Know-Nothing Party believed that Irish Catholic immigrants were responsible for almost all of America's ills. Fortunately, nationalistic bigots like this faded into the distance as the nation moved to confront bigger problems. Unfortunately, other such bigoted movements would arise after the Civil War, the most famous being the Knights of the Ku Klux Klan. 4. If at first you don't secede. Constitutional scholars still argue over whether the Confederate States had the right to secede from the Union or not. Obviously, this question was immaterial to Abraham Lincoln, who refused to acknowledge their secession and treated the states as rebels instead. It wasn't a question of slavery for Lincoln, who wrote the following in August 1862. If I could save the Union without freeing any slaves, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing all the slaves, I would do it. And if I could do it by freeing some and leaving others alone, I would also do that. Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation of January 1st, 1863 took the third course. Lincoln bravely freed the slaves all over the Confederacy, while saying nothing about slaves held in Union slave states like Kentucky, Maryland, and, yes, Missouri. Lincoln's means were often open to question. Suspending the writ of habeas corpus made it possible for the United States to imprison citizens indefinitely without even giving a reason. Again, the end was undoubtedly good. Freedom, at least officially so, for all Americans, and the Union, the grand experiment, saved.